Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Well, Dave, it looks like you're on the road again. You're in some strange environs there.
Not again, still. Definitely still out and about, just here trying to get everything organized in Nashville. I did not go back to the green room of the venue, but the venue is coming together quite nicely. I'm gonna share a couple of little insider tidbits that I'm excited about, separate from just seeing you on stage and seeing Dr. Carson up on stage with you. The food that we're starting to get together for this thing. I love to eat. If anybody hasn't realized that about me yet, I love to eat. And the food,
I do too much.
You and I both. I've now had 3 meals at the restaurant that is going to be providing the food for this event. My goal is to make it through their entire menu before before the event. And I will say I am typically the go-to for meat, right? Everything is, I want chicken, steak, whatever it might be. But it was recommended to me and I tried it. They have a fried avocado taco that is absolutely incredible. This restaurant is really pretty amazing. That's going to be providing the food.
This menu, right? I just want to make sure our members know this is like authentic. This is Tennessee food.
I don't know if I would call it authentic. I think it's a bit of a fusion, so to speak. What they've done, it's called Mojo's Tacos. A little shout out to our friend Will, who owns the restaurant. Will and Dave, who own the restaurant. What they have done is they've taken Nashville. Food common to Nashville, like Nashville hot chicken, and they have made tacos out of it. So the entire menu is tacos and nachos and this sort of Mexican food, Tex-Mex hybrid, but they're using things like fried chicken and pork green chili, and different chickens and meats and everything else like that. That's just really, the fish taco also was absolutely phenomenal. You get great fresh fish down here off the river, and so it's been fun. And then they also own this really incredible bakery that will be participating in the event as well, called Five Daughters.
So then we're going to eat donuts and cake, huh?
Yeah, donuts, croissant donuts. I think they call them cronuts.
Pass a message along to those guys. Let them know that I'm trying to keep my slim girlish figure in shape here. So I want the carb-free, fat-free, calorie-free version of all that.
Tom, it's called self-restraint. We teach it every day.
And sometimes it is quite the struggle,
But isn't that your favorite conversation? I mean, you love to talk about that night when you open that refrigerator door. Are you going to have the carrots on the wall, or are you going to go for that last piece of chocolate cake? And man, is it hard to say no.
It's really hard. And and I'll reveal something a little personal about myself. I got in this habit when I was a kid. I mean, I was doing this in high school. I love to eat at night. Like, I will wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I can put away a meal and go to the refrigerator, see whatever the leftovers are. And now I'm in my 50s. And the problem is my metabolism has slowed down to a crawl, and I still like to eat at night. And so it's a struggle sometimes, that self-restraint.
Right.
But, Dave, so just in case any of our members have not heard, what we're talking about is July 28th. We have an incredible event that is shaping up. That's why you are there in Nashville, helping to get everything lined up. We're going to be on a stage, and we're going to be putting on a full-blown, professionally produced, live, in-person show about the beauty of America. We're going to talk about the beauty of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, remind Americans why their country is worth loving and protecting and preserving. And we have a really special guest, someone we're partnering with, Dr. Ben Carson. is going to be there. He's going to be on stage with me part of the time. And then we're going to do a VIP reception afterwards, and he's going to be there at the reception. This is very much a partnership with him and his organization. And we're hoping to attract a huge crowd. So I would ask our members right now, mark off July 28th. And, if there's some traveling involved those days around, we would love to have a big contingency of our members come to Nashville and join us. It's going to be, what a fun summer destination. Go hang out in Nashville for a day or two and enjoy the scenery, enjoy all the great restaurants and bars and clubs there. We'll be releasing a lot of more detailed information as soon as you get the details nailed down there. We're pretty close to the venue and all that kind of stuff. And then what's going to happen? I think we'll create an Eventbrite page. Is that right? Yep. Where people can get tickets and things like that. Yeah. And we'll send notifications out to all of our members, letting them know how to get tickets if they want to come.
Absolutely.
And that's July 28th. That should be on your calendar.
I got to tell you, the venue, you haven't even seen the venue other than a little FaceTime video that you and I did, and when I walked you through it. For our members, this is a place, first of all, for anybody familiar with the CMT, the country music television show Crossroads, it's a fairly popular show. This is actually the venue they film the majority of those Crossroads concerts. This is not a small... This is not your local wine bar. This is not your local coffee shop. This is a really incredible venue that has done some major concerts with some major people. Even more than that, some people might find it interesting. President Trump held a rally in this venue in 2019 leading up to the election. So You'll be taking over a stage and that he was once on. Dr. Carson has been on that stage before, as have a number of other people in our space. So it's a great place. And there's a lot of great stuff going on around there.
Hey, like they say, go big or go home, right? And we're going big. We're not going home.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we put out our case study this month on Juneteenth, and earlier this week, the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, published an article that you wrote that was similar, that was based quite a bit on the case study, but scaled way back. For the sake of editorial purposes.
By the way, I want to give a quick shout out to we have some friends at AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research. They do some great work. They really do. I would encourage our members to check them out, follow them on social media, check out their website. There's one fellow in particular. I know him. His name is Philip Magnus, and he's an economist. And this guy, he's very bright and he's very dogged. When he sees something not quite right, he latches onto it and he doesn't let go until he's unpacked everything. An example of that is when the New York Times launched their 1619 project. Phil Magnus, he immediately started. First of all, he went and took screenshots. He started seeing all these problems. So right off the bat, he had the foresight to take screenshots of everything, because sure enough, they later went back and changed stuff, and they didn't announce it. Normally a newspaper, if they change something, they have a little notice, that this was an error or mistake, or no notices. They just subtly change key phrases that had caused all kinds of trouble and controversy. And anyway, I just want to bring his name to the attention of our members. Phil Magnus, he's a young, bright scholar who's worth watching and paying attention to, because when people are lying or cheating, he calls them out.
We should introduce Phil to the internet Wayback machine. There's actually a website that you can use, and it registers old versions of websites, and it takes pictures and marks the date and time every time and it's pretty interesting because it tracks when it's been updated, so you can see how many times it's been updated over over time. And when you go through even the little slightest changes, it tracks. There was a change. Here's a new picture. Be an interesting experiment to watch him go through that when he gets in that mode.
They did publish a little essay of mine on Juneteenth, and the big message of the piece. And I encourage people to go read it. I put a link up on my Facebook page. It was saying, look, number one, all Americans should be celebrating Juneteenth. I mean, it's a tremendous historical date of freedom when a group of slaves, after the end of the Civil War was over, and they didn't know that they were legally freed by way of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And then, of course, a few months later, Americans would adopt the 13th Amendment, formally constitutionally abolishing slavery everywhere. And the Union Army showed up and announced to all these, enslaved men and women and children, you are free people, live as you want to live. And so all Americans who love freedom, who hate slavery, they should be celebrating this, talking about this. And the part of my piece, the emphasis of my piece, I really aimed my essay at Republicans. I said, there are a lot of Republicans who ignore this holiday. They either don't feel comfortable talking about it, or they mock it and they think it's just some made up silly thing. And yet Juneteenth signifies a tremendous Republican victory. It is that fight and struggle to abolish slavery in the United States. That's the greatest thing the Republican Party ever did. That was the Republican Party at its best. That's what it was formed to do, was constrain slavery and then eventually get rid of it. And they accomplished that goal. And it boggles my mind today that Republican politicians and activists and Republican consultants and those types, they want to distance themselves from any discussions that have to do with slavery or race. And I think that's a big part of why Juneteenth sort of makes them uncomfortable. And the point of my essay is, hey, wrap yourselves in this, talk about it, hold it up, and take some credit for it. Go ahead, because Republicans deserve a lot of credit for Juneteenth.
There's a couple of points that you make in the piece and that you just made that I want to dig into a little bit. And one of those is, you make the argument that most people look at our founding as the period from 1776 to 1787, the creation of the Declaration through the passage of the Constitution. And you make the argument that really our founding starts in 1776 and extends all the way until Juneteenth, June 19th. What is it, 1965?
1860
or 1865.
Yeah.
So June 19th, 1865. And you make this argument that our founding really goes that entire way, because our founding was really based upon the idea of all men are created equal. Slavery is not okay. And our founding wasn't complete until we eliminated slavery. As you titled the piece, it's what makes America so unique, was this idea of all men are created equal. We have certain self-evident, unalienable rights that make us equal. I thought about that in terms of one of the big critiques you saw from a lot of Republicans on social media on Juneteenth was they didn't like that it was being dubbed by many as Independence Day, right? They say we already had an Independence Day. Independence Day is July 4th, 1776. You can't have another Independence Day. And one of their big pushbacks was this idea that it was Independence Day. And I thought about that in terms of your argument, because I totally agree with your argument. And I really like your argument. I agree completely that is, I would deem that the completion of phase one of our founding. Let's say.
Hey, Dave,
go ahead.
Let me qualify for the benefit of our members, because sometimes we say things and we make arguments here at the Vino Veritas Society, precisely out of our devotion to Veritas. It puts us at odds with the academic world, with the state of scholarship, right, and academic thinking today. And this is a case in point. I just want to make sure that our members understand. If you go ask most ordinary say PhD historians, right? When was the American founding? They would all say, well, it's that period. They might say that the Declaration was more the Revolution, and then the Constitution was the founding, the establishment, but somewhere there in the 1770s, 1780s, that's the founding period. And what we're suggesting is kind of a novel way of looking at it. I mean, we know what happened in the 1770s. We're not denying that. What we're saying is, when you think about those philosophic ideas that the Americans devoted themselves to, the regime, the actual regime they created, fell short. The actual regime didn't rise up to the level of those ideas, mainly because of the presence of slavery. And so, in that sense, in a philosophic sense, the regime either remained incomplete, defective somehow, or we had to get rid of slavery. One of the two. And it remained incomplete and defective for decades. And then we did the work and we got rid of slavery, and good for America.
Right. So it's an interesting idea to me that we have decided that the start of the revolution, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? If we had signed the Declaration of Independence and lost the revolution, there still would never have been a United States of America, right? I mean, all of the people who signed it would have just simply been hung in the streets and taken out. So you can't say that there would have been a United States of America if we had lost the revolution. Yet we've chosen that date in the middle of the Revolutionary War, the date that we signed this declaration, as that was our founding. That was Independence Day. And I think on another token, it would have been interesting to say the date of the end of the revolution could have also been considered Independence Day. It's interesting to me that we chose this 1776, this day we signed the Declaration. We still weren't an independent country at that point. We still weren't the United States of America. Yet we've chosen that as our date. And I only point that out because I think it's worth pointing out to everybody. This goes out to all Americans, Republicans, Democrats, anything else. We get so defensive about, I want to preserve something that I believe in the goodness of, that we kind of get lost in the weeds a little bit. And there were a lot of people on social media who were heavily defending July 4th and Juneteenth can't be a holiday because you're calling it Independence Day and we already have Independence Day, instead of embracing what it really is and the good thing that it really represented. And it was just this idea of, I have to defend this thing that I love so dearly. And everybody who has heard me say more than 5 words in my life knows that I think the Declaration of Independence was one of the most beautiful documents ever written. I think what it means, what it's done for people, what it's done for the world has been absolutely astounding, and is incredibly important. And I will never, ever do anything to diminish the importance of that document. And at the same time, I love the theory. I love your argument that the idea of the Declaration still isn't complete. And we just took a giant step forward. We finished what I would call phase 1, which is eliminating slavery, coming with the Juneteenth holiday. So I just encourage people to not get so dug into I have to defend July 4th, and therefore I'm not going to like Juneteenth.
Yeah, I would put it in this way. I would say what happened through the course of the Civil War and 1865 in particular, that year. I mean, you have several really important things happen in 1865. One is the war ends. It's the conclusion of the Civil War. Lincoln, of course, is assassinated. In April. Juneteenth happens when the Union Army marches into Texas, which was when we think of Texas today, you think of the whole United States, and Texas is sort of halfway east to west. It's right in the middle. But at that time, Texas represented really it was the westernmost extreme state within the Confederacy. I mean, that was way. That took a long time to march an army out to Texas, right?
If you've ever driven from Atlanta to Texas, it's a long drive.
It's
and that's
drive.
In modern cars that you can go 65, 75 miles an hour. Imagine doing that by horseback back in the time of the Civil War.
That's right. And then, of course, at the end of that year in 1865, the Americans passed the 13th Amendment and abolished slavery throughout the United States. And that was necessary because, remember, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only applied to rebelling states who had claimed to secede and form the Confederacy. That was not all the slave states. There were several that had. Kentucky had stayed in the Union. Delaware was Missouri. These were the so-called border states. These were states where slavery was still legal, and they had not seceded. They had stayed in the Union. Their representatives were in Congress, and therefore the Emancipation Proclamation didn't affect those states because Lincoln said this was a war effort out of the states that were making war on the United States.
Can I point out to people real quick? I want to remind everybody, because what you just said is really, really important to this conversation. If you are going to be a defender of Lincoln, you're going to have people coming out saying the Emancipation Proclamation didn't mean anything because it was unconstitutional. And I think that the mere fact, or they say Lincoln didn't care about the Constitution. He was willing to violate the Constitution in order to achieve his objective. And you, as one of the preeminent scholars of Lincoln, Harry Jaffa as one of the preeminent scholars of Lincoln, talk a lot about his commitment to defending the ideas of the Constitution and not violating the Constitution. He used the Emancipation Proclamation was part of his war powers. That's why those states did not get affected. That's why those states that stayed as part of the Union, but still had slavery, they were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation for the very reason that they were not at war with the Union. So if they're not at war with the Union, he didn't have the constitutional authority to emancipate their slaves. It was only the mere fact that he had war.
He specifies this in the Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote in there that this power, it exists only at a time of actual armed military conflict, that he wouldn't have, if there wasn't a war going on, he would not have this power to interfere with slavery in any states. It's only because some states had waged war against and right, they started the war with the bombing of Fort Sumter. And then he makes it clear in the Emancipation Proclamation that he's doing this as commander in chief, not merely as president, but in a way, more importantly, the Constitution also says, right, the formal title is President of the United States, but then in the second section of Article 2 of the Constitution, it says the president also is commander in chief of the Army and Navy. And that's where he gets his power. He is commander in chief of the Army and Navy at a time when the United States is at war. And so he can only use that power on objects of war. The Union is not at war with Missouri. Missouri hasn't waged war. Missouri's a state in the Union like any other state. And so the Emancipation Proclamation cannot constitutionally be applied to Missouri or to Delaware or to Maryland or to those border states. And, it's fascinating. You see Lincoln's mind at work, and he talks about this. He gives speeches, he writes letters, he explains over and over his constitutional rationale, right? He is very much wants to exercise only those powers the Constitution delegates to him as president. And because of his devotion to the Constitution, you get a whole body of literature. Scholars for over a century have just made fun of the Emancipation Proclamation, saying, well, the only places he could have enforced it, like Missouri, it didn't apply. And instead, it applied to places where he couldn't enforce it because these are places in rebellion. And so, South Carolina just laughed when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. They're like, yeah, come down and try to enforce that right now. That's the critique on the one hand. On the other hand, you get the critique of, oh, well, Lincoln just didn't care about the Constitution at all. He violated it in all these things, including the Emancipation Proclamation. And for those critics, the real response is then explain his incredible, careful constitutional considerations. And he is putting all this out there for the American people to judge him. He's saying, I think this is constitutional, and here's my argument. Here's my argument why. If I'm wrong, right, you, the American people, correct me, impeach me, wait until the next election and vote me out, right? But he was making constitutional arguments about why he had the power to do it. The other, I wanted to go back to an earlier point, where you have so many well-intentioned patriotic Americans. They don't like Juneteenth. It rubs them the wrong way. They're not quite sure what to think about it. They get defensive about, as you were saying, this idea of Independence Day. We already have an Independence Day. We don't need another one. A big part of that, I'm sure, is partisanship, just sheer ugly, modern, hyper partisanship. The fact that it was a progressive Democrat president who signed the bill and, making Juneteenth a federal holiday. It was Joe Biden. I think that's the reason many conservatives push back, just because we become so hyper partisan, right? Republicans are going to oppose anything Democrats do, and Democrats are going to oppose anything that Republicans do. It doesn't even matter what it is. It doesn't even matter what the merits of the action are. But the deeper kind of philosophic consideration, Juneteenth was it was an Independence Day. It wasn't a national Independence Day. It's not like a new nation was created, but it was a personal Independence Day. You can't be independent personally if you are either dependent on someone else or enslaved by someone else. You're not independent. You're living in control or being controlled by someone else. And in that sense, Juneteenth absolutely was a day of great personal independence. And I'm perfectly fine if people talk about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the topic of Juneteenth, and on this topic of Lincoln being a devotee to the Constitution, on Juneteenth, I decided I was gonna get on social media a little bit, and I don't do this often, and I typically try to avoid Twitter. I will tell you, I was dismayed at how awful Twitter has actually become. And I know all these people want to talk about bots and all of that. There are just a lot of ignorant, willfully ignorant, angry, nihilistic people on Twitter who just want to pick fights. And like you said, just be hyper partisan bullies. And that goes, we got to be honest, and I'm going to be honest, that goes on all sides of the spectrum. I posted your article in response to the Daily Wire's Michael Knowles. He posted something anti-Juneteenth. And I said, I encouraged him. I said, I would encourage you to read this commentary by Dr. Tom Cranowiter. It might make you think differently. And I immediately said something. Somebody saw the title, saw it said uniquely American, and he immediately thought that you were writing about how slavery was uniquely American, which we all know is absolutely not the case. You've never made the argument. And I got jumped on. I mean, this guy pounced as quickly as he could and was angry. And this, I said, whoa, slow down.
Hey, Dave, I just clarify for our listeners. This was a fan of Michael Knowles. This is a conservative.
Correct.
This is a conservative out there. You posted my article about celebrating Juneteenth, and he pounces on you and starts calling you names.
Because he only read the headline and didn't read the article. And he thought that he saw when it said uniquely American, he just assumed you were saying slavery was uniquely American. And he had clearly never heard of AIER because they would never post anything that said slavery was uniquely American. And I said, slow down. I said, we're not talking about slavery. We're talking about a country being founded on an idea. And that is uniquely American, unless you can point me to another one. And I said, it was the very fact that this was founded on an idea that allowed Lincoln to accomplish what he did. And the guy finally ends up going back and reading, and he actually wrote me an apology. on Twitter, which you never, ever, ever see.
That's a big victory right there.
I was delighted that I actually got an apology, but
yeah,
I really got pounced on. And one of the things that I got pounced on was I commented on another post. I said to everyone, the big pushback that everybody gave, and I think one of the topics we wanted to get into today, the big pushback that everybody gives when you say that Juneteenth was a Republican victory, right? When you share your comment that Juneteenth was a victory for the Republican Party. Well, the response by the left is, well, that's fine because that's before the party switched, and the party switched. And I saw it over and over and over again, and I finally had enough. I decided to jump onto the feed of Diamond and Silk. For those who know them, they're the two Black ladies who have a podcast, a conservative leaning podcast, and they had posted that it was a simple Facebook post or a simple Twitter post. Just a reminder, it was a Republican who freed the slaves and issued the Emancipation Proclamation that we celebrate on Juneteenth. I responded on there, backing them up, saying, for those of you who are saying that's because it was a party switch, when did it happen? And many of you are saying 1964. So does that mean that you reject all of the Democrats before 1964? Do you reject FDR? Do you reject Woodrow Wilson? Do you reject their mentors like Charles Merriam and John Dewey? And we start going down this road, and everybody calls me ignorant, and the comments were just astounding. And I said, I made the comment that Abe Lincoln was clearly devoted to the Constitution. And they said, absolutely not. Abe Lincoln violated the Constitution. This is an old argument made by both sides of the aisle, right?
Yep.
I mean, you wrote an entire book called Vindicating Lincoln that was addressing both sides who were saying Lincoln was doing that. And I think the conversation we just had is so important for people to understand that anybody who wants to make this argument that the party switched, most of them start with, well, Lincoln didn't believe the Constitution was right either. He violated it. And this is sort of the start of showing people how they're wrong about that commitment that Lincoln had to the Constitution.
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. Couple of things before I forget. Well, one, I always like to offer for members of the Vino and Veritas Society who want to dig in deeper, just some scholarly references. And one is my own book. I have a chapter length discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation and the politics surrounding it, the military strategy, and the constitutionality, the constitutional challenges and questions about it. The most comprehensive account is actually a strikingly beautiful book by Alan Guelzo, Guelzo. He did an entire book-length discussion treatment of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the title of the book. It's just titled The Emancipation Proclamation, and it's absolutely fantastic. And Alan is a really gifted. He's an unusual historian in that he writes beautifully. It's pleasant to read. He's a master of the historiography. For those not familiar with the academic world, historiography is just a fancy word for historians commenting on what other historians have said. So looking at the historiography, right, being aware of what other scholars and academics have said.
Not to be confused with current lawyers who study case law instead of studying the original meaning of the Constitution.
That's right. And then that's one of the things when you work your way through the academic world, whatever discipline you end up specializing in, you're supposed to be familiar with the literature, right, in your discipline and your topic of specialty, whatever that is, and then you'll build on that and add to it. And I mention that because the historiography around Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, first of all, it's enormous, and that speaks to something very interesting. I've mentioned this before. There are more books that have been written about Lincoln and the Civil War than have been written about Socrates, Jesus, and Shakespeare combined. I mean, just give you a sense of a friend of mine I'm Facebook friends with. He's traveling around Europe, and I don't know why he started doing this. He's all over the place. He started capturing with photos statues of Lincoln, and it turns out when you travel around Europe, they're all over the place. Abraham Lincoln is all over Europe. He might be one of the best known figures around the globe. I can remember reading some journalists this is from 25 years ago, and this was one guy. He was the African, what do I want to say, the African correspondent for the Washington Post. He was stationed in Africa. He was there during the Rwandan genocide and all that terrible stuff.
Wow.
And he was interviewing people in these little, poverty-stricken little villages where people are living in huts and they don't have clean water, right? And they're always scrambling to find the next day's meal. And many of them didn't know much about the United States, but he would mention the name Lincoln. They all knew who Abraham Lincoln was, that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, right? They knew that. And I mention this because I don't claim to be a political consultant, but I know something about persuading people, and I know something about the plucking emotional chords of memory that seem to resonate with people. And Lincoln's a big deal. He's a big deal. He should be a big deal for Americans. He's a big deal for many people around the world. And it astounds me that Republicans don't hold Lincoln up more than they do. In fact, I suspect Democrats have actually promoted Lincoln more and better and more effectively in the last 5 decades than Republicans have, which is just sort of mind-boggling. And it goes to that whole point of this, alleged party switch, which is, it's nonsense, and yet it's one of these myths. There are a few others that have become so widespread, mm-hmm. and they're so persistent that it's now just become sort of a matter of orthodoxy. Like of course that's true. Like the earth is round, right? It's not flat, it's round. I mean, of course, right? Who would question that? Well, of course the party switched. I mean, just like everyone claims to know, well, of course FDR and his New Deal, the government programs solved the Great Depression. Of course,
right.
Of course they did, right? And most people who utter these things, they don't actually know much about the subjects. They don't dig in. They don't care. They're just repeating things that they've heard, and it makes them feel better. It aligns with their political and cultural preferences, and so they're very quick to mock, right, and dismiss people who disagree. But if the Republican Party was formed in 1854, Lincoln was the first successful presidential candidate. One of the things I point out in the article, if there was no Republican Party, Lincoln never would have been elected president. He was elected by the Republican Party, nominated by the Republican Party, and elected by Republicans and people willing to form a coalition with Republicans. And if Lincoln had not been elected, he never could have issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And if he never issued the Emancipation Proclamation, there would be no Juneteenth to celebrate. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all of this quite literally is the work of the Republican Party, and they should be talking about it and celebrating it. When you look at the life and career of Lincoln, one of the things that is very consistent about Lincoln over the course of 4 decades, that man, once he discovered the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, his love and respect and his devotion to them only grew. He studied them, and the more he got to know about those ideas and principles, right, and he practiced talking mm-hmm. about them, communicating them. It took him many years to be able to, formulate the little phrase, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That opening of the Gettysburg Address. That is the result of many years of studying those ideas, practicing how to communicate and speak about them and write about them. But he stays devoted to the principles that he never wavers, never once ever wavers. And if that's Lincoln's purpose, is to uphold the principles of the Declaration, to bring the Constitution in line, to align the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence, which is exactly what the 13th Amendment does. It elevates the Constitution so that it's morally in line with the principles of the Declaration. And the 13th Amendment is the work of Lincoln. Lincoln is the one, from the moment Lincoln got reelected, when he was elected the second time, that is his, I mean, he wants to win the Civil War, of course, and the 13th Amendment. He knows that everything he had done as president, these were mere executive orders, including the Emancipation Proclamation. It was just an executive order.
Right.
The next president could undo all of this. Even legislation that had been passed, that can easily be undone by future Congresses. He wanted a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States because of his devotion to the principle of equal individual rights and the idea of equal protection of the laws for equal individual rights. Now, if that's Lincoln and that's the founding of the Republican Party, and a progressive wants to insist that the party switched, then my question is, so where is the party of Lincoln today and the party of equal individual rights and equal protection of the laws? Where is that? Is that the Democratic Party? Is that what progressives want to say, right? That they switched, and so the Democratic Party today is the party of Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence and equal protection of the laws? Because the Democratic Party today stands for exactly the opposite.
Right.
They stand for domestic political tribalism, literal tribalism, like dividing Americans into groups and offering special perks to some and special rights to others and putting special burdens on some. That's not Lincoln. That's not the Declaration of Independence.
Well, and even further, they're the party that wants to say the founding was racist, that everything Lincoln fought for, the ideas that he fought for, the people that he studied and respected and tried to fulfill their goals, their mission. Those people, the Democratic Party wants to tear all of them down. And quite honestly, the Democratic Party, yes, they might have done more for Lincoln in the last 5 years than the Republican Party has, but they're also still trying to take his name off of buildings. They're also still trying to say he didn't do enough. They're also trying to say that everything he believed in was bad. And so there is no justification anywhere to say that the Democratic Party today is the party of Lincoln.
Just a quick note about in the scholarly realm, it's really fascinating. There are critics of Lincoln on both, if you want to say the left and the right. I really don't like that terminology. That's probably the subject of a podcast for another time. Talking in that background of left and right and what they used to mean and what they mean today. But the point is, there are critics of Lincoln across the political spectrum. And in general, you have conservative types, constitutionalists, libertarians. Their critique of Lincoln is Lincoln violated the Constitution. Lincoln destroyed the system of federalism and the big realm of state authority that existed prior to the Civil War. That's their critique of Lincoln. The critique of sort of modern progressive historians, academics, their critique is that Lincoln did too little.
Right.
He didn't act fast enough. He didn't abolish slavery quickly enough, and that he let the Constitution stand in his way. When he could have just issued executive orders freeing all slaves ever, he didn't, because he said he didn't have the constitutional power to do that. And it's really interesting. One of their critiques is that whatever Lincoln did to mitigate slavery and to alleviate the suffering of Black people, it wasn't for the right purposes. He didn't really care in his heart of hearts. He didn't really care about Black. He was just a political animal, and he was going to say and do anything, to win elections and build coalitions, right, and that sort of thing. But there's another piece here that is often doesn't get talked about at all. this whole notion of the party switching, usually it zeroes in on the 1960s. And you have a couple of important things happening. 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act. And a year later, 1965, we have the Voting Rights Act. The argument goes that once Lyndon Johnson, he was the president at that time, he was a Democrat. Once Lyndon Johnson reaches out to Black Americans and starts offering them things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Republicans counter politically by reaching out to racist white Southerners. Mm-hmm. And say, well, right, if the Democratic Party is going to become the party of Black Americans, then all you white racists, you should start supporting Republican candidates. That's the argument in a nutshell. And either modern progressive critics will either say the Republican Party became racist, or at a minimum they'll soften it a little bit and they'll say, well, you heard this with Trump a lot. They're willing to appeal to racists. Maybe they're not racist. I heard many progressive commentators say this about Trump. Well, maybe Trump because people point out, well, Trump has employed all these people, different skin colors, and men and women. He's not a racist. And they'd say, well, maybe he personally isn't a racist, but he's really comfortable appealing to racists. Yeah. And his voters are really comfortable appealing to racists. There are so many problems with this. And I don't know that we have time to go through everything. One feature is in 1968, this is the next presidential election after those big monumental pieces of legislation were passed. You get a disaffected Democrat named George Wallace. He was the former governor of Alabama, and this guy's a thorough. He is a Black hating segregationist. He does not think Black people have any business, participating in civil life in the way white people do. Right. And the Republican Party doesn't want him. He's not a Republican. He's a Democrat who runs on a third party ticket. And all the states of the old South, the core of the old Confederacy, I'm talking about Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, those states, they all vote for George Wallace. Sure. They vote for this segregationist Democrat, right? They don't vote for Richard Nixon in 1968. There's another piece of this that deserves a bigger conversation than we can have here. Progressives have been brilliant at labeling. Well, this is a subject near and dear to your heart, Dave. The whole idea of branding. Right? Creating a brand, They propose legislation that it's progressivism. It creates big bureaucracies staffed with unionized, bureaucrats. And then they put a brand on it, a label, and they say that's a civil rights legislation. Yep. and so that's one of the great complications here, because Americans today look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act and they say, well, it says it in the title. It's about civil rights. So if you're for civil rights, then you must support the Civil Rights Act. And if you oppose the Civil Rights Act, well, then clearly you're a racist. You don't like Black people, right? Very few people are nuanced and thoughtful enough to step back and say, hey, wait a minute. Barry Goldwater stepped back and say, what you're calling a Civil Rights Act, gosh, you're creating enormous federal bureaucracies that are unconstitutional, and they're going to go tell people how to run their businesses and with whom they have to buy and sell things, who they have to hire. That's not civil rights. That's progressive central planning, right? So he pushes back against that on constitutional grounds. And of course, pundits look at that today and say, well, the only reason anyone wouldn't support the Civil Rights Act is because you're a racist. Well, I'll put myself out there and say, hey, if I was there in 1964, I would have pushed back and I would have said, no, this is not a Civil Rights Act. This is a progressive big government bureaucracy act. That's what it really is, disguised as civil rights. Here's the piece that I want our listeners to think about. It turns out Black Americans started voting Democrat long before the 60s. It goes all the way back to the 1930s. And I can remember when I first started bumping into these numbers and looking at them, I was puzzled because I thought, well, wait, I had heard this party switch, and that I knew that Black Americans after the Civil War, of course, they're voting Republican, and they're voting Republican throughout the South. Most Black people lived in the South because they had been slaves. The Civil War happens. They're free men and women. They're voting for Republicans. Some of them run for office as Republicans, and they're getting elected in places like Alabama and North Carolina. They're actually getting elected to the state legislatures as Republicans. And I thought that Black Americans had been voting Republican all the way up to the 1960s. And then you get this switch. They started voting Democrat in the 1930s. And I thought to myself, well, that must be because Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal was bribing them. They basically offered them a bunch of free stuff. And it turns out even that didn't happen. When the New Deal came along and Roosevelt starts imposing price controls and increasing the minimum wage, you know what actually happened to poor Black people in America? Unemployment among Blacks went up. Because if you're running a small business and it's the Depression and you're barely surviving, and all of a sudden you've got to pay more, you're going to fire some employees. Who's the first employee you're going to fire? Very likely. At that time, the uneducated Black man, that's who you're going to fire. Yeah. And they did fire them. And so the New Deal didn't actually help Black Americans, but Roosevelt, you know what Roosevelt did do? He was the first Democrat that started openly courting Blacks. He appointed Black people to key positions. He created something he called a Black cabinet. They were like Black advisors to the president. His wife Eleanor would do all these public appearances with various Black leaders and people like that, sending this message to Black Americans: we welcome you into this party. At the very time, Dave, this is what kills me about Republicans. At the very time, people like Herbert Hoover, who was a disaster, who Black Americans voted for Hoover. They stuck with Hoover in 1932. They stuck with Hoover because Hoover was a Republican. And all these Black Americans thinking, well, we're Black Americans. We, Republicans ended slavery and won the Civil War. So, yeah, we're going to support the Republican, even though we don't know that Herbert Hoover can handle this whole problem of this economic crisis. Hoover wanted nothing to do with Black people. Didn't really like Black people. I don't know that he hated them, didn't do anything hurtful to them, just didn't want to associate. There was not a Black person in sight in anything that he ever did. If you were a Black American reading about President Hoover, seeing President Hoover, hearing him on the radio, there was nothing that connected you to him. Roosevelt comes along, says, we have Black people all around us, and starts sending that message. And very quickly, by 1936, that's the first time FDR runs for re-election, a majority of Black voters in America vote for Franklin Roosevelt, including in northern states that were Republican strongholds. They start turning to the Democrats, to Roosevelt. And this is my point about Democrats have sort of hijacked. They've co-opted this whole realm of civil rights, of we're the party to help Black Americans. And throughout it, many Republicans have just been quiet. They just don't respond. They feel uncomfortable talking about it. Case in point, we started talking about Juneteenth. Juneteenth happened in 1865. Black men and women and children learned from Republicans that they were free. Republicans just didn't talk about it. Juneteenth was celebrated at the local level. Often it was just like neighborhoods or families would have a little, dinner on June 19th and talk about it. It was a century later. It's the 1960s before the first state, and it's Texas, makes Juneteenth a state holiday in 1968, I think, or 1969. And you know who made that happen in Texas? a group of Democratic legislators.
Right.
Democrats introduced the legislation saying, let's go celebrate Juneteenth, right? This is a Democratic thing. And Republicans are sitting off on the sideline twiddling their thumbs. And so, on the one hand, you going back like to the 1930s and then back to the 1860s, that seems like really long ago, sort of. But at the same time, oh my goodness, our politics today is still very much shaped by those events. And then what people did after, how they marketed, how they branded these things. And the Republicans have just been miserable at branding and marketing their own achievements and talking about their own record.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about Hoover and FDR in the 1930s. We're still doing the same things today. The parties are still doing the same things today, and I think the reality is the optics make it appear that the parties have switched. The optics make it appear that the Democrats, while institutionalizing and ideologically moving as far away from the Declaration of Independence as possible, while moving as far away from the Constitution as possible, trying to get rid of these documents, separate themselves from the founding, all of those things, from an optics standpoint, they seem to be embracing equality of all people much more than the Republicans do. They seem to be embracing the American idea of equality from an optics standpoint, whereas the Republicans talk about wanting to save the Constitution, maintain the ideas of the Declaration, maintain the ideas of the founding, yet don't know enough about Lincoln, don't embrace Lincoln as their foundation of the party, and don't show the optics of being of an equal nation. And that's really why it's so easy for so many of these people to believe that the party switch actually happened. And I think that goes beyond just blacks today. I think if you were to look at the Trump presidency, again, everybody who's been watching this for a while knows I supported a lot of what President Trump did in his 4 years. There were some things that I was let down about, and I will talk. I've talked about those publicly, but I liked a lot of the things he did. At the same time, from an optics standpoint, he did not make it look like there was this all-inclusive, all-welcoming, we support everybody, even though his policies reflected that. And it made it very, very difficult for him to, he was so successful in his policies about lowering unemployment for all Americans, no matter their skin color, no matter their race. He did so many great things for minority communities. And yet at the same time, from an optics standpoint, from some of the things that were said, he made it harder for people who wanted to hate him. He made it easier for those people to say, see, I told you so, because the optics simply weren't there. And I guess I would leave that as maybe our call to action for this podcast is to anybody who is actively involved in the Republican Party, to anybody who is actively involved in politics, really think about, should we be embracing Lincoln more than we are? Should Republicans be embracing Lincoln more than they are? And are the things that you are embracing, the things that are we talked a few weeks ago about how the Democrats are willing to die on the hill of abortion, and this now what's turned into really not a pro-choice movement, but a pro-abortion movement.
Right.
I mean, some of the demonstrations we've seen, especially in front of Supreme Court Justice House, are really disturbing. They're willing to die on that hill, but are you the hill you're willing to die on as a Republican? Is that a hill that Lincoln would have died on? Is that a hill that represents America and the values that the Republican Party are supposed to embrace, or are they really just progressive values that are on the other side, right? Progressivism is this idea of central control. Lincoln would not have been in favor of centralized control. And it doesn't matter if it's for a good moral cause or a bad moral cause. Lincoln would have been against centralized control and the freedom for all people, and really decide here What are the hills worth dying on, and what should we be embracing?
Yeah, I think another way to restate that, I think the most important task for Republicans is figuring out what the Republican Party is. What does the Republican Party stand for? And I mean, beyond its gigantic, massive platform that it produces, every 4 years, which nobody actually reads. What does it mean in the hearts and souls of Americans? What does it stand for? What should it stand for? And we're suggesting it could stand for Lincoln. It could stand for Lincoln and the principles that mattered most to him, which were the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, enshrined right there in the most famous political speech arguably in world history, the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
That's what happened those 77 years ago. He's referring to the Declaration of Independence. And it means, to solve these problems, it requires more than just slick consultants and politics as usual. It requires some learning. I mean, not all Americans have to become historians, but Republicans, they should know more about their own story than they do. They should know about the history of their own party. And the truth is, there's no better place to learn that than the Vino Veritas Society.
We teach it and we focus on it because it is so beautiful. It is so ideal and so perfect and so beautiful that it's a great story. There's so much to talk about there. Embrace it, love it, live it. It's funny, and I want to bring this up as we wrap up. You talk about the massive platform. Go back and read the platforms in 1856 and 1860 and 1864 when Lincoln was running for office. It was a page and a half long. You can read it, and even more importantly, you can understand it. Everybody could read it and understand it, and it was simple, and it was right there in front of him. You talk about branding.
I'm in my office, and right over on my bookshelf there, I have a collection of old platforms, and you're right. They're like a page and a half, 2 pages, really short.
It is this simple. You have that book, and I remember we pulled it off the shelf one day. I took a picture of the Republican Party platform from 1860. It's on my phone. It took one picture to have the entire platform on my phone, and I can show it to anybody at any time. I mean, that's how simple this has to be. We make this so complicated because we want to play into this progressive game. Stop making it so difficult. The ideas of the founding are beautiful. We must defend them. We must guard them. It's why we have the Vino Veritas Society. It's why we say no sumus custodes.
Stop guarding progressivism and start guarding the ideas of the American founding.
That's all this is about. And we will keep doing that every week.
All right, Dave, good luck as you continue getting things lined up and safe travels. And a reminder for everyone, July 28th, if it's not on your calendar, put it down. That evening we'll be in Nashville, Tennessee, and it's going to be a bang-up show.
I'm going to tell everybody, I'm starting to feel like a bit of a local. I'm starting to get to know my way around this place, and I can't wait. I get to feel like all my friends are going to come visit me in Nashville, and I get to show everybody around this place. It's going to be so much fun. We'll go do dinners, we'll go have some drinks, and we'll have a lot of fun, and that night in particular is going to be a blast. So we'll just keep doing what we're doing.
All right, till next time.
No sumus custodes.